All right, here we are in Chapter 7, and we're going to be talking about learning. There are different kinds of learning that psychology studies. We're going to talk about Pavlov and his drooling dogs. We're going to talk about B.F. Skinner and his attempts to train rats and pigeons and stuff using reinforcement and punishment. And then we'll talk about social learning, which was founded by Bandura. We got cock-a-doodle-doo, not cock-a-doodle whatever, learning from the people around us through observation. So how do we learn? Well, for one thing, we learn from experience. For another thing, we learn by associating things in the environment. Through experience, we notice predictors of important events. You know, us humans don't like to be surprised, and most creatures don't like to be surprised. Your dog, your cat, look for predictors of important events and learn from that. We learn from experience that our actions have consequences, that sometimes the things that we do produce rewards from the environment, sometimes they produce punishments from the environment, sometimes it produces absolutely no response from the environment. Those consequences teach us about the advisability of our behaviors. We learn from observing other people and their consequences, or the outcomes that they experienced, and that advises us for which behaviors to engage in. Through association, we learn that certain stimuli occur together, that we can use one stimulus to predict the occurrence of another one, and that if we see one of the stimuli occur, that it's likely that the other one's about to happen too. We learn through association that our actions have consequences, right? We come to associate certain behaviors with certain outcomes. And we associate information with each other, and that allows us to store information effectively for future use. So we learn through experience, and experience is really fueled by this tendency for us to want to associate things together. Now, there are different types of learning, like I mentioned on the front slide. There's classical conditioning, that's Pavlov and his drooling dogs. There's operant conditioning, where we change our behavior in response to consequences. That's Skinner and his rats. And then there's cognitive learning, which is learning by observation and encoding information. Classical conditioning is special because it says that we can learn to associate a meaningless stimulus with a meaningful stimulus. We can put those two things together and use one to predict the other, right? And that's really useful. Operant conditioning says we change our behavior based on the consequences that that behavior elicits. So we're more likely to do behaviors that produce rewards. We're less likely to do behaviors that produce punishments or that get ignored. Cognitive learning says that we learn things through observation and through associating information together. So we're going to take these types of learning one by one, nice and deliberately, so that hopefully it'll make sense. Okay. I forgot to mention that classical conditioning and operant conditioning are both types of what we call associative learning, where the learner is putting things together, either two stimuli, a meaningless stimulus with a meaningful stimulus, or behavior with its consequences. So we call those associative learning techniques. Okay, let's get to classical conditioning. It was founded by a guy named Ivan Pavlov, and maybe he really pronounced it Ivan, but that's okay. So Ivan was a Russian physiologist. Sometimes when students send me emails about their psychology class, they spell it physiology class. This actually says physiology. Physiology, of course, is the study of, your body's functions and stuff like that. Pavlov was particularly interested in digestion. So he was interested in the role of saliva in the digestion process. So he accidentally discovered classical conditioning because in his research he wanted to collect dog saliva. And so he put these pipettes on dogs' salivary glands, and he expected those pipettes to fill up whenever the dogs ate food, because he figured that saliva was for digestion. But what happened, purely by accident in his mind, because he wasn't a psychologist, was that the dogs initially started drooling only when they had food in their mouth, but pretty soon they started drooling to the tone that was emitted by the kennel whenever they allowed a caretaker to come in and present the food to the dogs. And so pretty soon the dogs learned that that tone was meaningful, that it predicted that food was about to come. And so the dogs would start drooling in anticipation. If you have a dog and you've ever fed them, you know for a fact that they start drooling in anticipation. When they start seeing the cues that they're about to get fed, they start drooling in anticipation. And you know, your dog probably has a reasonably rich and fulfilling life, other things to do besides get fed. For Pavlov's dogs, their life was very grim. I mean, this was 1904, 05, something like that, and they didn't have any protocols for really protecting animals in research. And so these poor dogs were, they had a collar on, and their collar was hooked to a hook, so they only had like a little short lead, because he had actually cut an incision in the dog's cheek to allow the salivary gland to be on the outside of the dog's mouth, so they could put a pipette on that salivary gland to collect the saliva. So he couldn't have these dogs frolicking and going outside and doing, you know, anything fun. So he kept them, you know, chained to the wall all day. And the most exciting thing that happened in these dogs' lives was getting fed. So if your dog drools in anticipation of getting fed, imagine how much these dogs drool, because this was like the highlight of their day. So what Pavlov figured out by accident was that the dogs associated the predictor, the tone, with the meaningful stimulus, the food, and started drooling in anticipation. So this was a big, exciting discovery. So how did it work? Okay, so here we have a nice dog and a bell. His initial study actually didn't involve a bell, but later studies they started using bells. So that's why it's called, you know, Pavlov's bell and stuff like that. Okay, so before conditioning. Okay, conditioning is another word for training or learning. So before the dog's been trained about anything, when you ring the bell, nothing happens, right? I mean, dogs don't naturally associate a bell with anything. A bell's meaningless, right? So a bell is a neutral stimulus. The dog doesn't respond. He might look at it or something, but I mean, it's nothing to a dog. Okay. Now, before conditioning, before we train the dog anything, food makes a dog drool, right? So the food is what we call an unconditioned stimulus. And drooling is what we call an unconditioned response, because you don't have to learn to drool when you have food in your mouth. That's natural. So any kind of stimulus that elicits a natural response is called an unconditioned stimulus. And the response to that unconditioned stimulus is called an unconditioned response. So when the dog starts eating, he starts salivating. Yay. Unconditioned association there. Okay, now, during conditioning, we ring the bell, and then feed the dog. So we've got a neutral stimulus, followed by the unconditioned stimulus, which will naturally cause the dog to salivate, produce the unconditioned response. Now we go through this a couple of times. Like for these dogs who had nothing else going on in their lives, it didn't take that many days of pairing the bell followed by the food before the dogs started to realize that that bell was reliably preceding that food. So during conditioning, you ring the bell, present the food. The dog eats the food and drools. You ring the bell the next time, you present the food, the dog eats the food and drools. After conditioning is complete, you know that you've achieved classical conditioning when you can present the formerly neutral stimulus and it causes the dog to salivate. At that point, that formerly neutral stimulus has now become a conditioned stimulus, a learned stimulus. And now that same response, drooling, now is being elicited by something that's been trained. So now that drooling response is called a conditioned response. So if you now are making a response to something that you had to learn was meaningful, you're making a conditioned response. So we ring that bell. Now that I've been trained, it means something to me, and I know it's predicting something I want, and so I drool in response to it. So the key thing with classical conditioning, and this is something that if you've had Intro to Psych as a high school student, you might not have learned. The key thing about classical conditioning is that you can condition any kind of involuntary response. Subsequent researchers discovered that not only can you teach a dog to drool, you can teach a rabbit to blink its eye, you can teach a sea slug to pull up its little tail, you can teach an animal of any breed to shiver. There are like these kind of involuntary responses. Okay, so here are some examples. And in my class, I make them shout it out. I'll give you a second to try and shout it to the computer, and then I'll tell you the answer. So you shout to the computer, and then I'll show you the answers. Okay. Your romantic partner always uses the same shampoo. Soon, the smell of that shampoo makes you feel happy. All right, so what would be the unconditioned stimulus in this scenario? The romantic partner. Because presumably your romantic partner naturally produces the unconditioned response, so I'm answering the next question, of happiness in you, right? So naturally the romantic partner makes you happy. Okay, now your romantic partner always smells of this same shampoo. Okay, so what would be the neutral stimulus in this scenario? Normally it's the shampoo, because you maybe have smelled that shampoo before, but it didn't mean anything necessarily. But it becomes the conditioned stimulus as the smell of that shampoo keeps being associated with your romantic partner. So what would be the conditioned response? Feeling happy when you smell the shampoo. And really the test of this would be smelling the shampoo independent of your partner and see if you get that same kind of warm, happy feeling that you get when you smell the shampoo on your partner. And you could substitute cologne or anything else if you want. The door to your house squeaks loudly when you open it. Soon your dog begins wagging its tail when the door squeaks. All right, what's going on here? What's the neutral stimulus? The neutral stimulus would be the squeak of the door. Normally a door squeak's not that meaningful, right? It's just annoying. What's the unconditioned stimulus? And what's the unconditioned response? Well, you are the unconditioned stimulus that causes the dog to wag its tail. The dog's happy to see you when you come through the door, right? So you are the unconditioned stimulus. The dog wagging its tail is the unconditioned response. So what's the conditioned stimulus? And what's the conditioned response? When the dog hears the door squeak, it has repeatedly been paired with your appearance. So it has become a conditioned stimulus. The dog knows that the door squeaking is alerting that you're about to walk through the door. So the dog treats the squeak as meaningful and produces his tail wagging behavior because he has associated the squeak with the appearance of his beloved master, owner, mommy, daddy, whatever you want to call yourself. The nurse says, "This won't hurt a bit," just before stabbing you with a needle. The next time you hear, "This won't hurt," you cringe in fear. All right, so let's start with the neutral stimulus. Should be the phrase, "This won't hurt a bit," because you've probably heard that before and it didn't mean anything, or it literally meant that it's not going to hurt. What's the unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response? Well, being scared of a needle is probably pretty natural, right? So the unconditioned stimulus is the needle, and you being scared is the natural response. The conditioned stimulus is the phrase, "This won't hurt a bit," because what we notice is you start to cringe in fear when somebody reassures you, "Don't worry, it's not going to hurt." You go, "Okay, yeah, I've heard that before," and it came right before the stabbing of a needle. So I don't believe that phrase anymore. Now I'm scared of it. That's a conditioned association where the conditioned stimulus is "this won't hurt," and you cringe in fear is the conditioned response. Final example. You have a meal at a fast food restaurant that causes food poisoning. The next time you see a sign for that restaurant, you feel nauseated. This is a great one because this is a really hard association to shake. If you get food poisoning, it's hard to unlearn that. So presumably that fast food restaurant's sign initially was a neutral stimulus. Maybe it was even associated with something pleasant because you chose to eat there, so maybe you liked their food before. Food, the taste of the food is the unconditioned stimulus that produces the nauseation, right? You ate something that was tainted and then you got sick. The conditioned stimulus is the fast food restaurant sign that makes you feel nauseated because of its association with the food that you ate before that made you sick. So you'll notice that these aren't all just drooling and eye blinking, right? Some of these behaviors actually appear kind of voluntary, right? The idea is you can classically condition any behavior that can be done sort of without intention. So you don't mean to feel nauseated. You don't mean to cringe in fear. Your dog isn't saying to itself, I'm going to wag my tail because I know my master likes to see that, right? You're not saying, I'm going to feel happy because the shampoo's there because gosh darn it, I am stuck with this romantic partner. You're not doing it, nobody's doing it on purpose in any of these examples. The idea with classical conditioning is that we can condition any kind of sort of involuntary or unconscious or behavior that can happen automatically. And that's the key to classical conditioning. We're going to condition stuff that you don't necessarily have to think about in order to produce that behavior. Okay, let's go ahead and take a break here. We'll come back and talk about the process of acquisition of classical conditioning.